What if I told you that the two nations who once aimed nuclear missiles at each other are, right now, at this very moment, sharing the same air, the same water, and the same 600 cubic meters of metal, 300 miles above your head? Two astronauts and two cosmonauts, born on opposite sides of a war that never officially ended, floating past each other in a narrow corridor, passing each other a wrench, sharing the same bag of rehydrated soup, trusting each other with their own lives every single second of every single day. This is not fiction. This is the International Space Station, and the story of how it came to exist is one of the strangest, most improbable friendships in the history of human civilization. It begins not with cooperation, but with fear. It begins with two superpowers so terrified of each other that they built enough weapons to end all life on Earth several times over. And yet somehow, from that terror, grew a partnership that has outlasted wars, sanctions, revolutions, and the collapse of an entire empire. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how bitter enemies became each other's only lifeline in space, why that partnership almost broke apart more than once, and why, even today, in the middle of one of the most dangerous periods in modern geopolitics, American astronauts still climb into Russian rockets, and Russian cosmonauts still climb into American capsules. Stay with me, because this story will change the way you think about what nations are actually capable of when survival is on the line. To understand how this rivalry began, you have to go back to the closing days of the Second World War, when two very different armies were racing across a broken Germany toward the same prize. That prize was not gold or territory. It was people. Specifically, it was the German rocket scientists who had built the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a weapon so advanced that nothing on either side of the Atlantic came close to matching it. The Americans captured Wernher von Braun and dozens of his top engineers, along with truckloads of blueprints and components, and quietly shipped them to the United States in an operation that history would later call Operation Paperclip. The Soviets arrived a little later to the same facilities, and while many of the top scientists were already gone, they still managed to seize enormous amounts of hardware, documentation, and mid-level engineers who understood exactly how the technology worked. Both nations now had a piece of the same puzzle, and both nations understood, almost instantly, what that puzzle could become. A rocket that could deliver a warhead to an enemy capital was also a rocket that could deliver a satellite into orbit, or eventually, a human being. The two ambitions were never separate. From the very beginning, spaceflight and nuclear war were two sides of the same coin, and that single fact would define the entire space race for the next several decades. For most of the 1950s, the world had no idea just how far this competition had already progressed behind closed doors. In the United States, the rocket program was public, funded through visible budgets, and often covered by newspapers and newsreels. In the Soviet Union, everything was buried under layers of secrecy so thick that even the chief designer of the entire Soviet space program, a brilliant and relentless engineer named Sergei Korolev, was never allowed to be publicly named while he was alive. He was simply referred to in state media as the chief designer, a phantom figure whose identity was treated as a matter of national security. Korolev had survived years in a Soviet labor camp during Stalin's purges, an experience that damaged his health permanently. And yet, he emerged from that ordeal to become perhaps the single most important individual in the early history of human spaceflight. On the American side, Wernher von Braun was doing the opposite. He appeared on television, wrote articles for popular magazines, and became something of a public face for the dream of space travel, even producing television specials with Walt Disney that imagined trips to the moon and beyond. Two men, one openly promoting a vision of the future, the other invisible to his own country's citizens, both racing toward the same finish line, funded by governments that saw rockets primarily as instruments of war. Then, on the 4th of October in 1957, everything changed in a single evening. The Soviet Union launched a small, polished metal sphere called Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. It was barely the size of a beach ball, carrying nothing more than a radio transmitter that emitted a simple beeping signal. But that beeping signal was picked up by radio operators and even amateur enthusiasts around the world, and it terrified the United States in a way that few events in American history ever had. This was not just a scientific achievement. It was proof that the Soviet Union possessed rockets powerful enough to place an object into orbit, which meant, by direct implication, that those same rockets could deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in America. The American public had been told repeatedly that their nation held a clear technological advantage over the Soviets. Sputnik shattered that illusion overnight. Newspapers ran panicked headlines. Politicians demanded answers. Schools across the country suddenly began overhauling their science and mathematics curriculums because officials feared the United States was falling behind in an education race as much as a technology race. Within a year, the American government had created a new agency specifically to manage civilian space efforts. And that agency, formed in 1958, was called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Or as most of us know it today, NASA. The Soviets did not stop to celebrate. Only a month after Sputnik, they launched Sputnik 2, which carried a small dog named Laika into orbit, making her the first living creature to circle the Earth. It was a public relations triumph and a scientific milestone, but it was also a quiet tragedy because Laika was never expected to return alive, and the technology to bring her back safely simply did not exist yet. The Soviet space program was willing to accept that cost in exchange for the achievement, and that willingness to take enormous risks in pursuit of being first would become a defining feature of the entire early space race on both sides. Meanwhile, the newly formed NASA was scrambling to catch up, and in early 1958, the United States successfully launched its own first satellite, Explorer 1, which carried scientific instruments that ended up discovering the Van Allen radiation belts surrounding the Earth. It was a real achievement, but by then the psychological damage from Sputnik had already been done. In the eyes of the world, the Soviet Union was ahead, and the United States was playing catch-up in a game it thought it had already won. The next major milestone came in April of 1961, and it delivered another gut punch to American confidence. A 27-year-old Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed into a spherical capsule called Vostok 1 and became the first human being to travel into outer space, completing a single orbit of the Earth in just under 2 hours before parachuting safely back to Soviet soil. Gagarin instantly became one of the most famous human beings on the planet, celebrated not just in the Soviet Union, but across the world, admired even by many Americans for the sheer audacity of what he had done. For the Kremlin, Gagarin was a walking piece of propaganda, proof that the communist system could outperform Western capitalism on the grandest stage imaginable. For the United States, his flight was a devastating blow, arriving less than a year after the country had already been humiliated by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. President John F. Kennedy, only a few months into his presidency, understood that America needed a goal so audacious, so difficult, and so far ahead of anything the Soviets had announced, that catching up would require an entirely new kind of national effort. Just weeks after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy stood before Congress and made a promise that would define the next decade of human history, declaring that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the end of the same decade. This was, in retrospect, an almost impossible thing to promise, because at the time Kennedy made that speech, the United States had accumulated a grand total of about 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience, all of it from a single suborbital flight by astronaut Alan Shepard. The gap between 15 minutes of spaceflight and a crewed lunar landing was staggering, and yet Kennedy's gamble worked precisely because it reframed the entire competition. Instead of trying to match the Soviets milestone by milestone, which the United States kept losing, NASA would leap ahead to a target so distant and so difficult that raw ambition and enormous funding could theoretically overcome the Soviet head start. Behind the scenes, the Soviet space program had similar lunar ambitions, but those ambitions were plagued by internal rivalries between competing chief designers, disorganized funding structures, and a political leadership that often prioritized short-term propaganda victories over the kind of long, patient, systematic engineering program that a moon landing actually required. Throughout the early 1960s, both nations kept racking up firsts, each one carefully timed for maximum propaganda value. The Soviets sent the first woman into space in 1963, a textile factory worker turned cosmonaut named Valentina Tereshkova, whose flight was, once again, presented as proof of the equality and progress of Soviet society. The Soviets also achieved the first spacewalk, when cosmonaut Alexei Leonov exited his spacecraft in 1965 and briefly floated in the vacuum of space, an event that came dangerously close to ending in disaster when his suit ballooned so much from internal pressure that he could barely fit back through the airlock. The Americans, meanwhile, were running the Gemini program, a series of two-person missions designed specifically to master the exact skills that a moon landing would require. Things like precise orbital rendezvous, docking with other spacecraft, and longer-duration spacewalks. Where the Soviet program often felt like a series of spectacular, high-risk stunts designed to generate headlines, the American program under NASA was becoming something more methodical, a step-by-step engineering campaign building carefully toward a single enormous goal. But methodical did not mean safe, and both programs paid a horrifying price for the risks they were taking. In January of 1967, a fire broke out inside the command module of Apollo 1 during a routine ground test, and the pure oxygen atmosphere inside the cabin turned a small spark into an inferno within seconds. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were killed before they could even open the hatch, and the tragedy forced NASA to redesign huge portions of the Apollo spacecraft from the ground up. Just months later, the Soviet program suffered its own devastating loss when cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died aboard Soyuz 1 after the spacecraft's parachute system failed during re-entry, causing the capsule to slam into the ground at tremendous speed. Komarov reportedly knew before launch that the spacecraft had serious unresolved problems, but the political pressure to fly on schedule for propaganda purposes was so intense that the mission proceeded anyway. These two tragedies, arriving within months of each other, revealed the true human cost hiding behind every headline and every celebratory parade, and they forced both programs to slow down, however briefly, and reckon with just how unforgiving spaceflight truly was. By 1968, the Soviet lunar program was quietly falling apart. Their answer to the powerful American Saturn V rocket was a massive booster called the N1. But the N1 suffered a series of catastrophic failures during unmanned testing, including one explosion so violent that it remains, to this day, one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. Sergei Korolev, the man who had guided so much of the early Soviet program to success, had died in 1966 following complications from surgery, and without his singular leadership, the Soviet lunar effort never regained its footing. The Americans, meanwhile, were closing in on their goal with remarkable speed. In December of 1968, Apollo 8 became the first crewed spacecraft to leave Earth orbit entirely and circle the moon, with its crew reading from the Book of Genesis in a live broadcast watched by thousands of millions of people around the planet. Then, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon, and Armstrong became the first human being to set foot on another world, an achievement that Kennedy had promised 8 years earlier and that many experts had considered impossible even 5 years before it happened. For the United States, this was the ultimate victory in the space race, a moment so symbolically powerful that it effectively ended the head-to-head competition in the public imagination, even though both nations continued flying missions for decades afterward. With the moon race essentially decided, both superpowers shifted their focus toward a new frontier, long-duration spaceflight and permanent habitation in orbit. The Soviets, unable to beat the Americans to the moon, pivoted hard toward space stations, and in 1971 they launched Salyut 1, the first space station in human history. It was a rocky start, marred by a terrible tragedy when the crew of Soyuz 11 died during re-entry after a valve failure caused their capsule to depressurize in the vacuum of space, killing all 3 cosmonauts in an instant. Despite this loss, the Soviets pressed forward with an entire series of Salyut stations throughout the 1970s, steadily building expertise in long-duration spaceflight that the Americans, focused so heavily on the moon, had not yet prioritized to the same degree. It was against this backdrop of continued rivalry, continued mutual suspicion, and continued nuclear tension that something remarkable happened in the middle of the 1970s. The broader political climate between Washington and Moscow had entered a period known as détente, a French word essentially meaning a relaxation of tensions, and both governments began looking for symbolic gestures that could demonstrate this new spirit of coexistence to the world. Space cooperation turned out to be the perfect vehicle for that message, because unlike arms control negotiations or trade agreements, a joint space mission was visually spectacular, politically low risk, and almost impossible for either side's hardliners to seriously object to. The result was the Apollo-Soyuz test project, an extraordinary mission in which an American Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft launched separately, met in orbit, and physically docked together using a specially designed adapter that allowed the incompatible docking systems of the 2 nations to connect for the very first time. In July of 1975, American astronauts Tom Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton shook hands in orbit with Soviet cosmonauts Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov, the same Leonov who had performed that dangerous first spacewalk a decade earlier. The 2 crews floated between each other's spacecraft, shared meals, exchanged gifts, and conducted joint experiments, all of it broadcast to television audiences on both sides of the Iron Curtain. It was an almost surreal image. 2 nations that had spent nearly 2 decades racing each other in a contest with existential stakes, suddenly smiling and embracing each other 300 kilometers above the Earth. Engineers on both sides had to solve enormous technical challenges to make this mission possible, since American and Soviet spacecraft used entirely different docking mechanisms, different atmospheric pressures inside their cabins, and even different electrical systems. And the process of designing a compatible docking module required genuine, sustained cooperation between engineers who had spent their entire careers designing systems specifically to compete against, and sometimes spy on, one another. Unfortunately, the goodwill generated by the Apollo-Soyuz test project did not translate into a sustained partnership. The broader relationship between the superpowers deteriorated again toward the end of the 1970s, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 pushed relations back toward outright hostility. The 1980s brought a fresh wave of Cold War tension, with President Ronald Reagan famously describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire and pursuing an ambitious and controversial missile defense concept that came to be known as Star Wars. Space cooperation between the 2 nations essentially froze during this period, even as both space programs continued to achieve remarkable things independently. The Americans introduced the Space Shuttle in 1981, a reusable spacecraft unlike anything that had flown before, capable of launching like a rocket and landing like an airplane. The Soviets, continuing their long-duration spaceflight expertise, launched Mir in 1986, a modular space station that would eventually become the longest continuously inhabited outpost humanity had built up to that point, hosting cosmonauts on missions lasting many months at a stretch, and setting endurance records that stood for years. Then, in an astonishingly short span of time, the entire geopolitical foundation underneath this rivalry simply collapsed. The Soviet Union, weakened by economic stagnation, political reform movements, and a series of dramatic uprisings across Eastern Europe, dissolved at the end of 1991. The Soviet space program, once funded with essentially unlimited resources as a matter of national prestige and military necessity, suddenly found itself operating within the vastly smaller budget of the newly independent Russian Federation, an economy in genuine crisis. The old Soviet Space Agency was reorganized into a new Russian entity that would eventually be called Roscosmos. And this new organization faced a stark and immediate problem. It possessed extraordinary engineering talent, decades of hard-won experience in long-duration spaceflight, and a fleet of proven, reliable rockets, but it no longer had the money to fully fund its own ambitions. This is the exact moment where the story of rivalry begins to transform into the story of partnership, because the United States saw an opportunity that went far beyond simple friendship. American officials were deeply concerned that if Russia's space program collapsed entirely under its financial pressures, the thousands of highly skilled rocket scientists and nuclear weapons engineers who had spent their careers serving the Soviet military-industrial complex might sell their expertise to the highest bidder, potentially including nations actively trying to develop nuclear weapons or long-range missile technology. Keeping the Russian space program alive, employed, and internationally engaged was not just a matter of scientific goodwill. It was viewed as a matter of global security. At the same time, NASA had its own practical problem to solve. The agency had spent years designing an ambitious space station called Freedom, but the program was massively over budget, politically unpopular in Congress, and at constant risk of outright cancellation. Russia, meanwhile, had unmatched real-world experience running a space station continuously for years through the Mir program. The pieces fit together almost perfectly. In 1993, the United States and Russia formally agreed to merge their separate space station ambitions into a single joint project. And as a bridge toward that larger goal, they launched the Shuttle Mir program, in which American space shuttles would repeatedly dock with the aging Russian Mir station. And American astronauts would live aboard Mir for extended stays, while Russian cosmonauts would fly aboard American shuttle missions. This program produced some of the most dramatic moments in the entire history of American-Russian space cooperation. In 1997, a cargo resupply spacecraft collided with Mir during a docking exercise, puncturing one of its modules and forcing the crew, which included American astronaut Michael Foale, to scramble in an emergency effort to seal the breach and save the station from catastrophic depressurization. Just months earlier, Mir had suffered a serious onboard fire. These were not smooth, ceremonial missions like the handshake in 1975. They were genuine crisis situations in which American and Russian personnel had to trust each other completely, working side by side under real danger, with lives depending on split-second cooperation between two crews raised in completely different systems, trained in completely different languages, and carrying decades of inherited mutual suspicion. Out of that shared crucible of shared risk came the International Space Station, whose first modules were launched in 1998. A Russian-built component called Zarya followed shortly afterward by an American-built connecting node called Unity. From the very beginning, the ISS was designed as an interdependent system rather than two separate national projects bolted together. The Russian segment provided the station's primary propulsion and reboost capability, using its engines to periodically raise the station's orbit and counteract the slow atmospheric drag that would otherwise pull it back toward Earth. The American segment provided the majority of the electrical power, generated by enormous solar arrays, along with the primary life support and environmental control systems for much of the station. Neither half of the station could function properly without the other, a deliberate engineering decision that some officials at the time openly described as ensuring that neither country could simply walk away from the partnership without crippling the entire project for both sides. It was cooperation built not purely on trust, but on carefully engineered mutual dependence. For over a decade after the Space Shuttle program was retired by the United States in 2011, NASA astronauts had no domestic vehicle capable of carrying humans into orbit at all. And the only way for American astronauts to reach the International Space Station was by purchasing seats aboard Russian Soyuz spacecraft, launching from the same Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan that had once launched Yuri Gagarin into history. This was an extraordinary reversal of the old Cold War dynamic. The nation that had once raced the Soviets to the moon was now entirely dependent on Russian rockets, simply to get its own astronauts into space, and Russia charged tens of millions of dollars per seat for the privilege. It was a partnership defined by mutual need rather than sentiment. But it worked, year after year, launch after launch, through a global financial crisis, through disputes over missile defense in Europe, through countless other diplomatic disagreements that would have derailed almost any other joint international project. The partnership faced its first truly serious modern test in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, triggering international sanctions and a dramatic collapse in relations between Moscow and Washington. At the time, a senior Russian official publicly suggested that American astronauts might need to reach orbit using a trampoline instead of Russian rockets, a sharply sarcastic remark aimed squarely at the United States and its lack of an independent crewed launch capability. Yet even during this period of open hostility on nearly every other front of the relationship, cooperation aboard the International Space Station itself continued almost entirely uninterrupted. Crews kept rotating. Soyuz launches kept carrying American astronauts to orbit. Joint operations kept running smoothly because both sides understood, at an operational level, that the station simply could not function safely without continuous cooperation between its American and Russian halves. It was one of the clearest demonstrations in modern history of how a shared, physically interdependent project could continue functioning, even while the broader relationship between two nations grew openly adversarial. The United States eventually solved its dependence on Russian rockets when private American company SpaceX successfully launched astronauts to the International Space Station aboard its Crew Dragon spacecraft in 2020, restoring an independent American capability for crewed spaceflight for the first time since the shuttle's retirement. This might have been the moment the partnership quietly faded away, but instead, the two agencies negotiated a new arrangement known as the Cross-Flight Program, an agreement in which American astronauts would continue occasionally launching aboard Russian Soyuz spacecraft, while Russian cosmonauts would in turn fly aboard American Crew Dragon capsules. The stated purpose of this arrangement was to ensure that if either country's spacecraft were ever grounded due to a technical problem, both nations would still have qualified crew members already on the station, capable of operating the other country's systems, and, if necessary, help coordinate emergency evacuation procedures. It was a strikingly pragmatic solution to a strikingly complicated problem, and it revealed just how much operational trust and interdependence had built up over more than 2 decades of continuous partnership. Then, in early 2022, everything on Earth changed again when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, triggering the most severe rupture in relations between Russia and the West since the height of the original Cold War. Sweeping international sanctions were imposed on Russia's economy, its financial institutions, and much of its technology sector. For a tense period, the head of Roscosmos at the time made a series of provocative public statements, at one point suggesting that Western sanctions could cause the International Space Station to fall out of orbit onto the United States or Europe, and even circulating a video depicting the undocking of the Russian segment from the rest of the station. These statements alarmed observers around the world and raised genuine questions about whether the decades-long partnership might finally be coming to an end. And yet, despite this extraordinarily hostile rhetoric, the actual operational cooperation aboard the station itself never stopped. Cosmonauts and astronauts continued living and working together in the same modules throughout the entire crisis. Cross flights on Soyuz and Crew Dragon continued as scheduled. Joint spacewalks continued to be planned and executed. The war raging on Earth, one of the deadliest conflicts in Europe since the Second World War, simply did not reach into orbit, and both space agencies made a clear, deliberate choice to keep that separation intact. Even now, years into this ongoing war, the partnership continues, though its shape has clearly shifted. Russia's ambitions for broader cooperation with NASA on future projects, including a potential role in NASA's Artemis program aimed at returning humans to the moon, have largely fallen apart, with Roscosmos instead deepening its cooperation with China on a proposed joint lunar research effort. Russia has become significantly more economically dependent on China, as Western sanctions have cut it off from many traditional markets and technology suppliers, and that broader economic reality is quietly reshaping the direction of its future space ambitions. At the same time, Roscosmos and NASA have continued renewing and extending their commitments, specifically to the International Space Station itself, with both agencies agreeing to keep the station operational into the year 2030, well beyond earlier timelines that had suggested retirement as soon as 2024 or 2028. Leadership from both agencies has continued to describe the relationship using words like professional, productive, and reliable, even while acknowledging real technical friction points, including persistent concerns about aging infrastructure and a series of troubling air leaks discovered in the older Russian modules of the station in recent years. Looking toward the future, both nations appear to be preparing for an eventual world in which they no longer share a single station together. Russia has discussed plans for building its own independent orbital outpost once the International Space Station is finally retired, while NASA is working with several private American companies developing their own commercial successor stations intended to take over many of the station's scientific and industrial functions. Even as these separate paths take shape, officials from both countries have indicated a desire to keep sharing technical information relevant to safety and emergency procedures even after their physical stations separate. A small but meaningful signal that neither side wants to completely sever the operational relationship that took so many decades, so many risks, and so many quiet acts of trust to build in the first place. When you step back and look at the full arc of this story, from a beeping metal sphere that terrified an entire nation in 1957, to two crews from opposing sides of a modern war calmly sharing a meal on the same space station in the 2020s, it becomes clear that the relationship between NASA and Roscosmos may be one of the most remarkable examples in all of human history of cooperation surviving in spite of, rather than because of, the politics surrounding it. It was never built on genuine friendship between governments. It was built on a shared, brutally practical recognition that space is unforgiving, that survival off this planet requires trusting the person floating next to you regardless of which flag they saluted growing up, and that some forms of cooperation are simply too valuable and too dangerous to abandon, to be allowed to collapse under the weight of conflicts happening far below on the surface of the Earth. Whatever happens next between these two nations, on Earth or in orbit, the story of how they became partners after being sworn rivals stands as a powerful reminder that even the deepest rivalries can produce something worth preserving, if both sides are willing to recognize what they would lose by walking away. If this deep dive into one of history's strangest partnerships gave you a new appreciation for what it takes to survive in space, make sure you are subscribed for more stories exploring the hidden history behind humanity's greatest achievements beyond our own planet.